welcome to our weekly whiskey podcast. My name is Max, and welcome to the Elements of Whiskey. I'm joined here by Chris from the Teeling Distillery, and we're going to discuss the new expression, the dark porter cask. We're going to hear everything from Chris, and if you have a bottle at home, grab yourself a glass, pour one out, or if you have our Dutch whiskey podcast subscription, you will have your tube, and you know exactly what to do. Sit back, relax, and we're going to talk about this Teeling dark porter cask. Hello, Chris.
Hey, Max. How you getting on?
I'm fine. Actually, I'm having a brand new whiskey here. When does it come out? Because it's brand new?
Yeah, so this is fresh off the shelf. I mean, by the time that obviously people are listening to this, it'll probably be available in Holland. But this is some of the hidden gems now from Teeling Whiskey Company. So this is our Teeling Dark Porter, and it will be available in Holland and now hopefully from March onwards.
All right. Before we get into the whiskey, I just want to have a quick chat about you, because who is Chris?
It's a good question. So I work for Teeling as the European brand ambassador. So my name is Chris Hayes. What that basically means is, I operate across multiple different markets on a daily basis. I'm very fortunate that I get the chance to, travel and talk to people all about Irish whiskey and specifically Teeling, which is, obviously something very close to my heart. But I also am very closely based in Dublin. So I work with our distillery team in our visitor centre, as well as our commercial sales team that are based in Dublin. So as you can imagine, the day-to-day kind of changes all the time, but that's essentially in a nutshell what I do.
And you actually live in Dublin currently?
I do, yes. I'm actually just in the process of moving. I'm glad that this is a podcast and not a video, because you'd probably see that I can't walk currently with the amount of things that I'm moving into my apartment at the moment. But yeah, we've just moved up to kind of near the Dublin mountains. So we have a beautiful view now at the moment. I'm hoping to go hiking there when I get a free chance, when I'm not moving flooring and moving, couches and whatnot.
All right. And I just want to ask you, do you have the same bottle as me at home? Can we do a quick nosing and tasting? Because I really like to try new whiskeys, but not really a big describer, at least not at a first time. And I literally opened this bottle 10 seconds ago. So please, Chris, talk me through it. What is it that we have in our glass? What is this dark porter?
Yeah, sure. So this is essentially the Teeling Dark Porter cask. Now, this is in collaboration with one of my favorite craft breweries at the moment in Ireland called Dot Brew.
Okay.
So essentially, this is part of quite a limited series of Teeling whiskey called our small batch collaborations. So anyone who's familiar with Teeling whiskey probably at some stage has tasted our flagship, the Teeling small batch.
Yeah.
It's, of course, a premium blend aged in bourbon and rum casks and bottled at that iconic 46%.
Mm-hmm.
From this whiskey stemmed this series of really interesting cask exchanges with different producers around the world. So wineries, breweries, distilleries, where we send them some of our stuff and they return the favor. Mm-hmm. And we make just, I think, really cool experimentation and great collaborations between the two. So this particular one, it's in some dark porter casks. At the base, it's 3 parts corn, 1 part barley, aged for about 6 years in bourbon, and then it's a finish in these dark porter casks. So with this particular series, this is not a marketing gimmick or a box ticking exercise or just an opportunity for us to sell cases. This is really coming back to an idea of a flavor discovery, and what Teeling is all about, which is trying to create the best whiskey we possibly can and doing this in a modern way, very much, I suppose, exposing and challenging consumers and how they understand Irish whiskey in terms of how it can be made.
All right.
So, experimentation is a big part of what we're all about.
All right. And there's a lot to unpack here. First of all, I want to do a quick nosing and tasting, because otherwise we will be talking hours and hours and still haven't had a sip of whiskey at all. So I want to start with that first. I had a quick smell, and I really like the beer smells coming through. I really find this is way more earthy notes in it, which I'm not really expecting from Teeling. Maybe except for the black pits, but from a regular Teeling, I don't get this intense earthy note from it.
Yeah, it comes through straight away, doesn't it? There's no doubt that it's aged in beer barrels.
Exactly. Yeah.
One thing that I love about it is the bitterness. Now, the bitterness is almost like a very bitter cocoa bean or coffee.
Okay.
It's that strong roasted flavor, but also there is that element of citrus in there, or even, leaning towards sort of hops on the nose, which I think for any beer lovers, this is a match made in heaven.
I can imagine if you are a craft beer guy or girl and you really like craft beers, this is something that might get you into drinking whiskey. I'm going to take a sip to you, Chris, in Dublin. Sláinte. This isn't something that I didn't expect at all.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a shock to the system, isn't it?
Yeah, no, because to be honest, you really briefly mentioned this. The Teeling small batch, and I need to be completely ashamed. Sorry, I don't have it at home currently. I don't have it here anywhere, but it is the most iconic Teeling, if we can say it like that. Everyone that I'm talking about Teeling, they said like, okay, the rum cask, like the small batch rum cask. This is something completely different.
Absolutely, and as you said, I think it's how we made our mark in the Irish whiskey industry, which was with the small batch. And it just goes to show, how we can change up the spirit by something as simple as the cask maturation. A big part of this series is really to show the versatility of our core, which is the Teeling small batch, and how we could discover new flavors and add to our repertoire by using unusual cask types that people typically don't normally, encounter on a daily basis. The thing that I love about it is obviously in the nose you have that really like dark and heavy, as I said, either muscovado sugar, dark chocolate, a little bit of citrus. You get onto the palate and it's much kind of, I suppose, brighter. You get that lovely rich malt character, a little bit of caramel. There's some fruitiness in there, like some caramelized apples or poached pears. Yeah, and then a hint of spice as well.
The graininess of the whiskey I really like. It feels light, but still has this full body. I still taste it right now. I think that it has a very nice, long, lingering finish. I really, really like that. But still, it's like 46%. For all the whiskey geeks, when we say 46%, they probably already know why we do it at 46%. But I'm really excited to hear from you. Why did you choose to do 46%? Is it basically all because of the chill filtration? Or is it to do with flavor or a combination of things? Or like, why is it 46%?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And something, I think a lot of people sort of expect that these decisions are made almost on a whim, that there's a lot of trial and error that comes to making these big decisions: what to bottle your whiskey at, what cask types to use, what mash bill, how you're going to distill it. These all come from trial and error. So with the small batch, for example, where this whiskey really stems from, originally there was multiple trials. We actually did blind tastings for a lot of consumers in Ireland, and we presented this particular product at a variety of different ABVs, so like 46, 50, I think in the low 40s as well. And for most people, it just kept that mouthfeel. As you said, the flavor was definitely the driving factor and why we decided to have it at 46%. From a more sort of geeky, sciencey perspective, yes, we can keep in the fatty acids and the oils and the esters, and that's great for flavor. But the mouthfeel as well is something that I think definitely comes from that higher ABV bottling. And that's really where it comes from. It came from trial and error, getting people to taste it, getting liquid on lips. And same with the rum influence. We tried out many different cask types. Some were very popular, others maybe not so much. As you can imagine, there are also failures as there are wins. Yeah. And this is where that iconic 46% comes from. So we've pretty much no bottlings at Teeling Whiskey, with the exception of one or two of our old vintages. Okay. That have dropped in ABV because of the time, essentially, because of the evaporation. But apart from that, we've nothing under 46%.
All right. But we are not here talking about the rum cask. We're here about the Dot Brew collaboration. And we discussed this before we started recording. For all our native Dutch listeners here, I'm planning on just having a more like, we are recording this on a Friday, a vrijmibo, as we call it, a Friday afternoon drink. Basically, so I brought in a beer from the Dot Brew. To be honest, I'm getting into like a collaboration rabbit hole because you guys collaborated with Dot Brew, and now I have a collaboration from Dot Brew with Brew brewery, if I'm saying that right.
I was going to say it's a bit of a tongue twister and an inception moment. Jesus. A collaboration within a collaboration.
Yeah, it is. It is insanely. For the people who want to know which I'm trying here, this is the well-rounded individual, a barrel-aged blend from red ale aged in American oak Amarone cask for 1.5 years, transferred to a dark rum for an extra 6 months, finally blended further in stainless steel with an amber ale aged in Heaven Hill bourbon barrels. Is this something Dot is famous for? All these.
I was going to say there's a lot to unpack there, isn't there? There's a lot going on, and it's absolutely iconic of what Shane Kelly and what Dot Brew is all about. So I suppose to give you a bit of a background on these particular casks that we've used for the Teeling Dark Porter, we were working with a brewery, and I suppose brewery is a very loose sense of the term, in the sense that he's essentially a gypsy style brewer. So what that means is someone who kind of moves from site to site. They brew in different facilities, and he has his own rack house. He has his own sort of barrels.
So he doesn't have his own brewery, basically.
He doesn't have his own physical brewery, no. Right. So Shane Kelly, he set up this brand a good few years ago, and I think he was kind of home brewer turned, full operational at a later stage. But essentially, what Shane, I think, is really well known for in particular is a lot of barrel-aged beers. So he's used everything from the likes of Calvados, Port, Amarone, whiskey barrels, of course, Irish single malt, a load of Teeling stuff, even more obscure like rum or tequila. He's some absolutely incredible beers. As I said, he's probably one of my favorite on the market at the moment, coming from Ireland. He really is changing the face of Irish craft beers. But essentially, we have had this long relationship with Shane for many, many years. Funny story, actually, he originally came into the Teeling distillery. He was sent there by his wife to essentially get him to be talked out of setting up his own company. She was like, no, go talk to the Teeling brothers. They will tell you that this is a terrible idea. You should not set up your own company. Okay. And it actually had the reverse effect, where he felt passionate about what they've done, and he decided to take the risk. But we've sent him, I think now, the guts of around 50 casks.
Okay, wow.
Over the last 5 or 6 years. So lots and lots of barrels that he's gotten from us. He has also given us more recently use of his canning line. Okay. So we started making, these are just in tests, so they're not finished products. Okay. But we've started experimenting with whiskey canned cocktails. Oh, so there's this nice kind of back and forth between the two companies. And Shane was using a lot of our small batch barrels for some of his dark beers. So, for example, oatmeal stouts or imperial stouts, all the good heavy stuff. He essentially brewed a variety of different dark beers. He sent us back those barrels, and we aged our whiskey in them for approximately about 9 months in total.
Okay.
So the whiskey that you have, Max, in your glass, it's 6 years in bourbon approximately. Okay. And then give or take about 9 months in those dark beer barrels.
All right. And to be honest, there's this thing, people who regularly listen to our podcast know that transparency is something that I'm very keen on. If you just, without me asking even, just say like, okay, it's 6 years, give or take, in bourbon barrels and finished for this period of time. But why doesn't it say on the label? Yeah, it's a really good question. And look, this is something that we've sort of taken as part of not only our core range, so from the small batch, the single grain, to the single pot still or black pits, to even some of these collaborations. With these, they are very much, as I said, an exploration of flavor. So we want to focus more on how they're actually produced, rather than being sold through an age statement. Because yourself, if you think of a general consumer and you're buying, let's say, a bottle of, Irish or Scottish single malt, we will instinctively make those associations. If we see 12 written on a bottle of whiskey, in our mind, without even having to do it, subconsciously, we will say to ourselves, okay, what other 12-year-old, Highland single malts do I know that I can compare this to? Yeah. And we want to sort of change the narrative and have a different discussion. But that's not to say, we're not transparent. We can absolutely tell you how it's produced. Okay. It also comes from the fact that with these collaborations, sometimes we go back and we repeat them. Okay. So, for example, we might redo the Dot Brew, let's say, dark porter, and use slightly different casks. Because they're all focused on flavor and they're not focused on an exact age, this gives us a lot more room then as a result. So it's not, I suppose, trying to be difficult. It's very much coming from a focus on the quality of the overall product. And is it something that people can reach out to you guys, like send you like a message on Instagram or Facebook to the Teeling group and say like, hey guys, I bought this bottle, can you give me some more information? Or is it just basically just swing by on a tasting and ask me then?
show up at my house. No, absolutely. And look, I get these messages all the time. People reaching out to me about our products. I'm more than happy to talk about our whiskey with anyone and everyone. One of the best sort of platforms that I'd recommend to people, I suppose a shameless plug, is the Teeling Tribe.
Okay.
The Teeling Tribe is an online community that we have where people can openly discuss, anything to do with our whiskey and by extension our production and our visitor centre based in Dublin. But yeah, not only that, but also a lot of the information on our products is available online. So on the Teeling website, for example, you can find a lot of information on the cask types used and the mash bills and how they're distilled. As I said, this one is 3 parts corn and 1 part barley. So it is, falling under that category of blended Irish whiskey.
That is something that I want to discuss some way more about. I want to circle back really quickly to my private comparison right here. I'm so sad that you don't have the same can as me.
I was going to say, I'm super jealous looking at the beer and the whiskey. It looks like such a good match.
Yeah, it is. To be honest, for everyone who has this whiskey at home, combine it with at least a craft beer from Dot. But this combination here really brings out the hefty cereal flavors of it. But the funny part is, to be honest, when I'm comparing them right now, when I take a sip of the whiskey, I now get this more fruity and more buttery character in the whiskey, which I know and love from Teeling. So it's giving me more which I know of, and more hiding the exotic dark porter things, which is kind of a shame if you like the more earthy impact of the dark porter. Really excited. I'm gonna just sip this throughout the whole episode if you don't mind. But I just want to get to know Teeling a bit better, because the first Teeling I know of is Walter Teeling. Can you tell me a little bit about him?
Yeah, I was gonna say that is a throwback. Yeah, so Walter Teeling is essentially the ancestors of the current generation. So Teeling Whiskey Company, as we know it, was set up as a brand in 2012.
Okay.
By Jack and Stephen Teeling. Now, if you jump back many, many centuries, the current family actually have deep roots in urban distillation that existed in Dublin for many, many centuries. The furthest that we can go back just with the Teeling family name in terms of producing whiskey in Dublin is Walter Teeling.
Okay.
So in 1782, which is you'll see on many of our bottles, which we can go into, I think, in a bit more detail, he essentially had the equivalent of like a craft distillery, so a small production in Dublin.
Okay.
Now that was subsumed by a larger company, but by the turn of the 18th century, so unfortunately didn't survive. Like a lot of Irish distilleries, financially it shut down. There was many crises that affected the Irish whiskey industry, and the Teelings were not outside of this in any shape or means. So that's where 1782 and Walter Teeling kind of comes into our story. Now, the interesting thing about the bottle design is you will see on any of our newer sort of rebranding, it all says 2012. So that's kind of one distinction that you'll see any of the kind of true diehard Teeling fans. The 1782 was the older bottle design, and 2012 was we decided to do a rebranding. It's when the brand was, I suppose, reborn. And it also signifies when the company was set up in 2012.
Yeah, for the people who are listening, they can't see this, but right next to me, there's an old tin sign from Teeling, which actually said Teeling since 1782. And on all the bottles, as you were saying, I was like looking around. I'm like, why does it say 1782? But it's only here on the sign. On the bottles, it says 2012, indeed. But I want to make a quick step in between 1782 and 2012, because there's another Teeling, which I found, and it was Mr. John Teeling.
Yeah, very, very significant individual for the Irish whiskey industry, not just for the Teeling story, but also for generally the Irish whiskey category. John is a fascinating individual. He did his doctorate, I believe, on the Irish whiskey revival during the 1980s. Now, at this time in Irish whiskey, we only represented 2% of global whiskey sales, so a very, small minority. There was only 3 active distilleries at this time, one of which was set up by John. So he decided to buy this old ethanol plant on the border pretty much of Northern Ireland and Ireland in an area called Louth. It's about 50 kilometres from Dublin. And he essentially saw an opening within the Irish whiskey industry to set up an independent distillery. So that was not owned by a large corporate, was very much family owned and done at an independent level, but also producing whiskey slightly different to what we were seeing from the other 2 producers at the time, which was, of course, Irish Distillers and Bushmills. So many people will probably know products that were part of the Cooley Distillery, which John set up in 1987, one of which is Connemara.
Yeah.
You know, Connemara to this day is still one of the globally renowned peated Irish single malts on the market. Of course, it's sort of come full circle with Teeling releasing our black pits.
Yeah.
Only just there, I believe, last year. I think my time is all completely mixed up with COVID, but yeah, I believe it was last year. The other two brands that were under the Cooley portfolio were Kilbeggan and Tyrconnell.
Okay.
So John really, I think, you know, helped Irish whiskey to gain momentum as much as, you know, Irish distillers and Bushmills. And he passed on the company to his sons, Jack and Stephen Teeling, in around 2010, 2011. So what they decided to do is eventually they sold off the company. They took a large proportion of the family stocks, around 16,000 barrels, to set up right in the heart of Dublin city centre, so an area called the Liberties. And that's, you know, really helped us with our own production, because it meant that we weren't waiting for, you know, new make or poaching. We weren't reliant on making gin. We could start from day one as a whiskey producer and really build the brand as we were waiting on our, you know, our own stock in inverted commas.
Yeah, because the old spirit and new spirit is something that I want to talk about in a second. And now we get to the current generation, to say so, Jack and Stephen. So those are basically the two people in charge of Teeling, but also the revival of it. Yeah,
very much the visionaries. You know, Jack and Stephen very much had this passion for Irish whiskey and a wealth of knowledge of the industry. They basically saw, similar to John, an opening where there was an opportunity to do Irish whiskey and present it in a different way. What I mean by that is, you know, you look at any of our products, higher bottlings of 46%, innovative cask maturation techniques, unusual ingredients. These are all signifiers of a new way of talking about Irish whiskey that was already, you know, arguably creeping in, but I think very much cemented by Teeling Whiskey, you know, with their inauguration as a distillery in 2015. When we started actually producing. So Jack and Stephen, you know, they saw examples of other urban distilleries in, you know, other respective countries. And they sort of asked the question, why don't we have a distillery in the capital of one of the biggest whiskey producers in the world? You know, we talk about the giants of whiskey production. We think of Scotland and, of course, America, Canada, Japan. Ireland is very much part of that conversation and always has been. You know, you look back in history in the 19th century where Irish whiskey actually dominated the global whiskey industry, represented 70% of global whiskey sales. So they, you know, very, I suppose, rightly asked this question, well, why don't we have a distillery in the capital, which was originally, you know, one of the kind of focal points for whiskey production. Like Dublin was very, very instrumental in the rise of Irish whiskey. Originally, back in history, there was actually 37 fully functional distilleries in Dublin. So between the kind of 18th and 19th century. So really a powerhouse for the category. And their aim was very much not only to, I suppose, revive Irish whiskey, but more specifically Dublin whiskey and their own family by extension.
What I'm currently wondering, right, and this is something that which I really like to discuss with people actually working in the industry. Is it feeling like competition? Is it like you guys are Teeling and Teeling is the focal point of Irish whiskey, and if you don't drink Teeling, you're kind of a loser? Or is it more like you guys are very welcoming to Irish whiskey, maybe taking it a little bit more closer, like Dublin whiskey? Is it more shared? Like this, we want to rebuild Irish whiskey, or is it we want to be just the biggest?
As a nation, you know, there's very much that close relationship between a lot of producers in Ireland, and there's that good working relationship there. But I also think, you know, the Irish whiskey category is growing at such a rapid rate. Like there's now over 40 distilleries in the whole country, and I think this is bringing that good natural competition. But I don't think that I don't know what I'm trying to say here, but yeah,
it is
essentially, yeah.
It's more a team effort. What I'm wondering, I want to talk a bit about some symbolism within Teeling in a bit. But now that we're talking about it, I want to make some quick comparisons, because I feel like a lot of people, especially here in the Netherlands, know about Irish whiskey a little bit, talking about like the famous brands, like stuff like your Teeling, your small batch rum cask. But I think that most people are aware of Jameson and Basically, that's it. So I want to really quickly have a chat with you about like what is Irish whiskey in Ireland and how does it differ from Scottish single malts, for example. So just so that we have like a brief base knowledge that we can all just like build upon. Because like you have some rules about casks in Ireland, better to say a lack of rules compared to Scotland.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Max. And I think the short answer is there is that looser legislation in Ireland in comparison to Scotland, if we just make a comparison between those two countries. Stylistically, there's a lot of similarities. So for example, in Ireland, we do also produce single malt, grain whiskey, blended whiskey. The fourth category that exists in Ireland that is a big difference between Irish and Scottish is single pot still.
Yeah.
So single pot still is a funny one because anytime you mention it to a whiskey producer, they think of the stills, they think of the alembics of how it's actually distilled. When in fact, pot still in Ireland has another meaning. It refers to the mash bill.
Yeah.
So if you ever see single pot still written on a bottle in Ireland, and this is a style that's actually geographically protected, it means a combination of malted but also unmalted barley. So barley that's been germinated, that you produce a lot of fermentable sugars eventually, and also unmalted, non-germinated, low in enzymes, low in sugar. Unmalted barley has this really interesting effect on the overall flavor in the sense it adds a lot of inherent spice, but also an oiliness. So it creates a completely different mouthfeel than, say, for example, 100% malted barley or a grain whiskey. So that's one of the big differences between Irish and Scotch. Stylistically, we have that, I suppose, additional category. This has a lot of history all around Ireland and particularly in the south, but also historically in Dublin. It's deep roots in the capital. The Dublin distilleries are very well known for single pot still, as much as, say, other regions in Ireland. In terms of the cask types, then, what we can do a little bit differently than in Scotland is the first thing is that we can use wood variants that are not just oak. So in Scotland, for example, you have to use oak. Now, it can be variants. So, for example, you could have, as you know, Spanish oak or French oak or Japanese or American. You might even have subspecies. Like, say, one example would be something called chinquapin, which is basically a subspecies of oak. But in Scotland, you have to mature in oak wooden barrels.
As a shameless plug, we have a Dutch episode about this particular wood type, the chinquapin cask. So if you are interested, just take a look at our playlist. We have a full episode about that whole wood. So just sorry, I felt the need to shamelessly plug something.
I was going to say chinquapin sounds like a Pokemon, but it is a type of wood that you can use to make whiskey.
Fun fact, it is easier to pronounce in Russian.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, just Google it. It is actually easier to pronounce in Russian.
I was going to say it's nearly incomprehensible when an Irish person tries to pronounce it. But yeah, outside of those, in Ireland, we can essentially mature in any style of wood. So you could take something very, rudimentary like acacia or mulberry or chestnut, and each of these, give a different mouthfeel, a different aroma, a different finish. They completely change up the flavor. Like, let's not forget, maturation is a big component of the whiskey production. But you can even use something a little bit more unusual. These are all acacia and mulberry and chestnut are definitely very forward-thinking if you were to compare them to oak. But you could even go the far end of the spectrum. Like, one thing that the Teeling has used recently is some amberana. Now, amberana, it's a Brazilian hardwood.
Okay.
You probably know it. It's used in, for example, cachaça production. So it's something that's not possible, within the Scottish whiskey laws, how you can make whiskey. And this gives us, I think, arguably a much wider spectrum of flavor that we can deal with and that we can experiment with to create entirely different products.
But does it also include stuff that has been aged on the cask? Because very recently, I know that in Scotland, there are changing up the rules a bit so they can allow tequila or mezcal casks, which previously wasn't able.
Yeah, so they've just opened up to agave-based spirits. Okay. Yeah, like Sotol, mezcal, tequila. And that's a very interesting change within Scottish legislation. In Ireland, it goes even wider. So for example, if we talk about things that you can use in Ireland that you can't use in Scotland, for example, and again, this is just examples of Teeling, we've used the likes of aquavit,
Yeah.
We've used gin, but even within those realms of possibility, you could use anything from, let's say, ex beer barrels, ex wine casks. You can use ex liqueurs, like say, for example, triple sec or Cointreau or vermouths, or even, something as far gone as, let's say, schnapps, or as I said, the example of aquavit. Yeah. These are all things that are not necessarily possible in Scotland. Okay. And if you definitely want to discover products like those, I would highly recommend looking at the Teeling small batch collaborations as a series. The Dark Porter is a great example of how we operate with interesting cask types. But that whole series is really, a good example of these.
Can I ask you something? Please don't find me rude when I'm asking this, but you say like experimenting is a big part, trying new things, stuff like that. But in my honest opinion, not every experiment has a positive outcome.
No.
Do you also feel like there were experiments where you're like, maybe we shouldn't have done this?
And it's so funny, isn't it? Like, I think people are also afraid to ask that question. When does it not work? And the reason that I said no straight away is I can think of a good example. Okay. The gin cast that we did. So this was with Kiru, who are a phenomenal gin producer based in Finland. Okay. And when we first put those into casks, within the first, I'd say 3 or 4 months, it was not good. It was super astringent. It was really heavy. It was just kind of completely off. Now, the end product was phenomenal. Okay. And I think what we did in the process is we had to transfer them into fourth fill American bourbon barrels to sort of soften the flavor and refine it. But that was a perfect example of initially at the start, it did not work. Okay. And there's many other examples of that, of whiskeys that necessarily don't turn out the way that you expect them. Like I think with focusing on maturation for the most part, so much can change, not only within, let's say, 3 years, which is the legal requirement for Irish whiskey, but even in terms of, a shorter period than that, with even a couple of months. Like this particular one, the Dark Porter, is finished for 9 months. That 9 months, you can really see the influence on the whiskey with just that short amount of time. Now, for finishing, that's quite a longer period. Most people look around the 6 to 9 months. So this is creeping a little bit higher. Like I'd say it's 9. It's in reality probably closer 9 to 12 months. But yeah. So to answer your question, there's absolutely examples where it hasn't worked, or we need to go back to it and change the recipe. And I think that's all part of the process.
And I'm taking a quick bottle from behind me, if you don't mind, because this is one of my favorites currently, which you guys did in your sommelier selection. Can you make a guess from the side of it, the color of the label?
Yeah, so I'm guessing that's a Margaux that you have. Ooh, or is that the Amarone?
It wasn't the Margoni. It's the Amarone.
It's not the Amarone?
It's the Amarone, yeah.
Oh, it is the Amarone. Yeah, I was going to say I recognized it from that gold covering on the cork. So the sommelier selection is an interesting series. Again, this is sort of a separate branch of the small batch collaboration. So instead of looking at a variety of different producers, we wanted to look at regional styles, and specifically looking at some of the most renowned wines in the world. So the idea is that we're going to look at 2 regional styles from a variety of different countries. So we've already looked at 2 from France. We're going to be looking at 2 from Italy. There is going to be more of this particular series coming in the future as well.
Ladies and gentlemen at home, I'm trying my best now for you guys to maybe pull out some more details. Amarone is from Italy. You say there are coming 2, which is the second one.
I was going to say, I was trying to dodge that question, but...
Oh, no, nope, it doesn't work.
There is going to be a second release later in the year. As they say, watch this space. Some very, very exciting stuff, again, coming from Italy. With the Amarone, again, it's bottled at 46%. It is the exact same base, more or less, as our small batch. So this is something that I find fascinating, is how much a difference using a different cask type can have on the overall spirit. Like if you were to pour yourself a dram of the Amarone and put it side by side with the Dark Porter, they would be completely different.
Yeah, definitely. But you're still dodging my question.
to be announced in due course. It'll probably most likely be available by the time people listen to this. So yeah, I'd say watch this space. It will come shortly.
I was doing my best for you guys. I was doing my best. We talked about the collaborations. There's one big topic which I wanted to discuss with you, which I decided on not discussing, and it was talking about like being a distiller in Dublin. And basically I settled on like really cool to discuss it, but I'm still here in the Netherlands. And if we're talking about cliches, it is currently raining. So I'm not here sitting and talking about Dublin. And I would love to visit you guys and talk with you in Dublin about how it is to distill in Dublin. So that's something that I want to discuss in the near future. Something else, and it is behind me, and said that it was one of the first things that you noticed, the Brabazon bottling. What is Brabazon? What is the deal with
I always joke with any of my Dutch friends that Brabazon almost sounds a little bit Dutch, doesn't it? It doesn't sound very Irish. But the name itself apparently the name itself apparently points back to a very well-known Irish family who built up a lot of Dublin city, and in particular the area where Teeling is built. So if you do get a chance to come to Dublin, and I highly recommend coming at this time of year, particularly now with a lot of things being back open. Our distillery is based, as I said, very close to the city centre in an area called the Liberties. More specifically in an area called Newmarket Square in the Liberties. Now the Liberties, it's a really well-known area for alcohol production. You've got a lot of great breweries, distilleries.
There are many songs written about the Liberties, if I'm not mistaken.
There's songs, poetry. It's an area in Dublin that has this very rich history. Originally, it was actually outside of Dublin. So if you go back towards the medieval era, it was about 1 kilometre outside of Dublin city, and originally, it was very important for the Viking settlement that was based there. But if you get a chance to come to Dublin and this particular area where we're based, you will actually see many streets that are named after the Brabazon family, because they built up this area in Dublin, particularly in the Liberties, as well as other areas in Ireland. In fact, where I work, so our offices is the old, and even if you look at the box max of the Brabazon, that building on the box is actually one of the old Brabazon family houses. So it has been renovated by the Teeling family, and this is now actually where our offices are, which I think is very, very cool. But yeah, so this is a single malt. This is a part of our single malt collection called the Brabazon series, bottled at a slightly higher ABV, so 49.5%, and specifically focusing on fortified wine casks. So the likes of sherry and port are the two main ones that we're using. Is that the third? My eyesight is actually terrible that you have.
It's number 4.
Fourth? Okay, so the fourth is the last of the series. Now, this is no longer in production.
The 4 is a white port, if I'm not mistaken?
Similar, yeah. So it's what's called Carcavelos. And Carcavelos, it is produced in Lisbon. It's a style of fortified wine. So this is a 13-year-old single malt that is aged for approximately around 11 years in bourbon and then finished in Carcavelos. And again, bottled at 49.5%. With the 4 and the reason that I tend to go more for the 3 is the 3 has these lovely like dark chocolate, red fruits, a little bit of spice, and I think it's just perfect for this time of year when it is that little bit colder and wet and rainy, whereas the 4 again, it's a beautiful whiskey, and I think it's just down to personal preference, but the 4 for me is a little bit brighter. It has those lovely apple and orchard fruits and maybe even a little bit of mint and like mango. Very like juicy, delicious, fruity whiskey. So if you prefer that style, that's what I'd recommend the Brabazon for. But me, I just love that sort of grape must and chocolate that you get in the 3.
It is so dense. It's so incredibly dense. I really love it. I don't want to be rude again, but I'm not a math genius. I'm not a rocket scientist. But if you guys were rebuilt opened in 2012 and you started producing whiskey in 2015, how is it possible that you produce a 14-year-old single malt last year? It doesn't add up.
Is it just magic? Yeah, I think, you know something, Max? I think this is the question that we probably get asked the most at Teeling Whiskey. And the answer is that when we first set up as a company in 2012, we took some barrels from that family reserve from the Cooley distillery, from John's operation. So that allowed us to take stock, some that's going back as far as the 90s. Within our portfolio at Teeling, we have a very extensive portfolio. Some that go up as far as, 37, 33, 30 years old, and then all the way down as far as, even 3, 4, 5 years old. But that's how, we have these old age statements, was because we have taken that family reserve. Now, we've just celebrated our 6th year anniversary in our distillery in the Liberties, which we're very proud about. I've been working with Teeling for about 5.5 years, so I've seen the growth of the company. I've seen the whiskey firsthand and tasted it, from infancy to now, and it's been fascinating, the journey. Within that time, we've distilled a massive amount of whiskey, so nearly 3 million litres.
Oh, wow.
And the great news is for anybody who's a fan of Teeling Whiskey, you're going to see a lot more of our stock coming from Dublin in the future, and very exciting products that, as I said, I've seen in the works for many years, and they're now starting to become ready to be released.
So it's basically, we have the old spirit, basically from the Cooley distillery from John Teeling, and now we have like the spirit of Dublin getting a point where it is getting released more often, I can imagine. But what is about like the spirit of Dublin? What is this? Because it is on basically all the bottles, I can see it, but what is it? Is it a play on words?
Yeah, well, I mean, first and foremost, I think it is that clever play on words, isn't it? But I think it very much captures first the passion of Dublin distilleries. As I said, part of our story was being an urban distillery. Mm-hmm. Let's not forget, there's a lot of challenges to setting up a distillery where you're not beside the raw materials. Even in 2012, this was at a time in Ireland and around the world where it was a recession. So it came with a lot of challenges and a lot of difficulties that may or may not have gone overlooked. But also, I think that the spirit of Dublin, not only celebrating urban distilleries, it also kind of points back to this idea of creative freedom when you're making whiskey. So if you look back in history, in just talking about Dublin whiskey, back in the heyday when Irish whiskey represented close to 70% of global whiskey sales, within Irish legislation, there was even less rules. So, mash bills would have been a lot more fluid. Types of barrels that you would have used would have been even more vast. And I think that's what we're celebrating with this idea of the spirit of Dublin. So it kind of points back to this idea of that experimentation side.
Chris, thank you so much for your time. We have been talking almost an hour about whiskey nonstop, and I think that we could talk for like another hour, which we should do. But I want to end this conversation with a non-whiskey related story about Teeling, if you wouldn't mind finishing on that note. I heard some rumors about the Teeling distillery, some sweet stories, if you pardon my pun, about a bee hive on top of the distillery.
Ah, yes.
I find that this is a lightly finishing of this segment. Could you tell me about the beehives at Teeling?
Absolutely, with pleasure. Yeah, the bees is a nice story. So at Teeling Whiskey, on the roofs of our distillery, we actually have a number of beehives. We produce our own honey on site. There's now a total of around 500,000 bees.
500,000
It is incredible. If you get a chance to get in a bee suit and go up there, you feel like David Attenborough for the space of about 5 minutes. It's incredible. Yeah, so we are working very closely with a guy called Ollie Nolan, who is a honey producer, among many other things, called Ollie's Farm is the company that he runs. And we then use that honey across our global drinks program, so as a more sustainable element within our cocktails, even down as far as our cafe with a lot of our food offerings. And we also sell the honey itself in our distillery. So that's where the story of the bees kind of came from. This I wouldn't say that I'm an expert in any shape or means, but if you have beehives within Dublin, it can promote a lot of the local fauna. And I think, it also really sort of speaks volumes for how we operate as a company in terms of the community elements. Teeling has made a lot of outreach to local producers. The brewery that you're drinking at, or the beer that you're drinking at the moment, is a Dublin brewery. The honey is also a local producer. So that's also a big part of our ethos as being a Dublin distillery, to support and promote the local community.
Very cool. Chris, thank you so much. Tell me, if people want to get in touch with you, how can they reach you? Can they send you messages? Can ask you questions?
Absolutely, yeah. As I said earlier, probably the best platform is social media. If you want, you can search for me on Instagram or Facebook. Just look for Chris Hayes and you'll probably find me quite easily under Teeling. If not, as I said, the Teeling Tribe is a great place to discover more about our products and talk to other, enthusiasts about Teeling whiskey is something that I definitely recommend.
All right, thank you so much. We are going to have a little quick chat when the camera's off, so I might figure out which is the second Italian wine cask that is coming up. And otherwise, I'm going to say thank you so much for your time, Chris. If you're sitting at home and really like this podcast and you're from the Netherlands, go check out www.elementsofwhisky.nl/podcast, which is our website, which you can find some more information about our podcast subscription, meaning that you could have this beautiful Teeling dark porter cask at home. Chris, thank you so much. I'm going to sit back, drink my beer, because I'm really enjoying this one, and maybe perhaps pour a second glass of Teeling. Let's see what we can find back here. Thank you so much. We are back next week with a regular episode in Dutch probably, but take a look at our big portfolio of other episodes. We're talking about other Dublin-based distillers. We're talking about some Scottish distillers. There's so much also in English, so please take a look at it. Send a message to Chris, say hi from us, and we'll see you next week for a new episode. Chris, thank you. Cheers.
Cheers, Max. Thank you for having me.
Chris, I'm definitely not recording currently.
I'll text it to you.
Ah, shit.